right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. This is not a typical student recital. Part of my degree, the portion of my degree is jazz studies, and then part of it is in sociology. So I decided to combine the two. I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this because of what I've chosen to study. So in 1959, Wright Mills published a book called The Sociological Imagination. He defined the sociological imagination as a way to understand the social world and one's place in that world. This allows us to free our mind from the narrow circle of our daily life and allows us to link the personal to the structural, locates one's self in the larger social context, link the personal to history, and locate today's society in a larger context of history in order to achieve an understanding of the intersection of an individual's biography and the larger movement of history. So in this way, we're not only to talk about the structural, but also history. So that's what I want to do with jazz. So this is a social experiment as well as a recital. You're not really going to go to a concert where someone analyzes this music in the way that I'm analyzing it today. So you guys are playing the role of the audience, we're playing the role of the jazz musicians, and I'm the band leader, and I'll be talking to you about the performance to reach an understanding of how jazz works in this kind of setting. So my hypothesis for the experiment is that if the general public took more time to be informed and exposed to this music, then the average American's opinion would change about this art form. So I'm doing this because as soon as I started really listening to jazz, it was very nebulous to me, and I had so many questions about it, and I had no idea what was actually going on. So I wanted to know why it sounds like that. What are the players doing? What's going through their minds? How can they play like that? And having studied this music, I'm closer to those answers. But as a band leader, because I'm graduating, I have to pique the interest of the general public. So I think the sociological imagination can help me do that. So throughout, we will be discussing why jazz musicians make the choices they do in the modern day. These decisions serve to function in the world of music, the world of art, and applying these concepts to real-world situations. So I have chosen tunes from different eras to illustrate my point. Jazz is made up of all kinds of different music, and chief among them is the blues. You can't talk about jazz without talking about the blues. So the first tune we're going to play for you is a blues that I wrote. 1, 2, 1. It's based off a traditional blues form, which means that it has the same harmonic structure and format as most other blues. It can easily be played in any key, and in fact, that's how I wrote this. Was I was playing a blues lick, and I was putting it through different keys, and I realized that what I had written was a blues, and everything else after that lick just kind of followed. So it's one of the most important concepts in jazz music. Every single jazz concert that you go to or that I've ever been to usually has a blues in it, and it's easy to memorize and improvise over. So this arrangement that I did is a little postmodern because it has that tradition of the old blues, but it's also got some elements that they didn't have around in that era. And it celebrates aspects of the past with some more modern things in it. So this is the lick that the melody is blues is based off of, which you can probably already tell. So when I was practicing that, that's how I ended up writing this blues. So on the sociological side of things, I have this quote by Gunther Schuller, who wrote in early jazz. Jazz was at this point not the product of a handful of stylistic innovators, but a relatively unsophisticated quasi-folk music, more sociological manifestation than music, which had just recently coalesced from half a dozen tributary sources into a still largely anonymous but nevertheless distinct idiom. So blues served the function of musicians, and especially African Americans, to release the woes of their life. And it's actually a happy music, which most people know. And we not only play it because it's part of the tradition, but it feels good to play it. It felt good to play that just then. And I'd like to make the point that it's an older music than jazz, but it's still used to inform the modern jazz musician on how they should sound. These sounds that we're playing have a historical basis and are part of this modern jazz sound. And so this music can stand on its own, but it also serves a practical function in the jazz world. It's easy to fill time, like if you're on a gig, anyone can play a blues, so it's easy to fill time with it on a gig, and it sounds good, so it's like a go-to thing to use. The melodies are easy to learn, it's easy to transpose it into new keys, and blues is thought of as its own genre, but people are still actively performing it even outside of the jazz world. So in that blues, you heard things such as call and response, like in that first melody, Will played that first lick, and then I came in and played it with him. It's based off a blues scale, which is what most of the melody was based off of. And much of jazz is about innovation, kind of like what I did with this. It goes back to the historical tradition, but then you add something new to it as well. So it's all about celebrating the music that came before now. So what I'm going to do now is play a tune from the swing era. And I'm going to do it on baritone, so I've got to switch. All right, so big bag music was actually the pop music of its era during the 30s. This was the Depression era, and no one could really afford to go out and see bands, but everyone owned a radio. And this music was very danceable, so they were hearing it all the time, they were able to dance to it. And I know it's kind of weird to think of jazz as pop music, but that's what it was. So big bands would travel across the country in buses, and these bands were 20, 25 people in a bus traveling across from gig to gig, and they were able to make a living based solely on being a musician. And they could even send money home just doing these gigs in a big band. And this contrasts to today because big band music is kind of disappearing. There definitely aren't as many as there used to be. And if any of us got a paying gig in a big band, it would not be able to support us. We would have to find other work. So the thing about this time period was because jazz was so popular, more and more white musicians were beginning to play. They were forming bands, and they would get a lot of gigs. And they'd get more gigs than a lot of black bands, and they got paid more money. So how does this swing style inform us about music today? Well, the piece that I played for you is from that era, and it's a transcription of Harry Carney playing this piece, and it's a piece by Duke Ellington, but Harry Carney played it, and it was written just for him. And it's not exactly what he played. It was adapted for the purpose of this lecture because we really haven't gotten into improvisation yet, and I did play some improvisation over that. But it's a very distinct style reflecting the big band era. A lot of the things, how I played, I wouldn't play if I was playing a more modern piece. So it was played with a specific goal in mind, and that was to try to sound as much like Harry Carney as I possibly could. So I sat there practicing with the recording over and over again, trying to sound like him. And Harry Carney was considered to be the father of the baritone sound. So it was really important for me to study him. So we're going to talk about transcriptions and what that means for jazz musicians. It's a common tool used by jazz musicians, and it's a process that involves listening to the greats of the music. It's a painstaking process. It takes a long time. You get better at it the more you do it, but you can sit down, figure out a single lick. You could figure out a whole recording, several recordings, or even an entire album of someone that you want to sound like. And you're supposed to learn and memorize it using your musical ear. And we do that at school every semester. We have to have a transcription that we play for the faculty. So this is done outside of the band setting, but it's like studying the music. It informs us on how to play, and we really absorb the sound that way. So I would love to play exactly like Harry Carney every time I pick up my horn, but I'm not going to because we all sound different, and that's something that is celebrated in the music, but in order to develop your own sound, you need to study these musicians and try to sound exactly like them. And it needs to be indistinguishable from how they play. So when you're playing with them, like all the articulation, all the musical emphasis, everything is supposed to be exactly the same. So this brings me to something in the jazz world that we don't often talk about, and that's kind of this idea of idol worship, which has negative connotations and doesn't. It's a way of studying the music. It helps us develop our sounds, and it helps us emulate other musicians. But through this process, back in the day, a lot of people, like, take Charlie Parker, for example. He is considered to be one of the greatest musicians of all time, but he was a drug addict and got into a lot of bad stuff, and that goes for Charlie Parker, Dexter Gordon, Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane. They all used heroin, and people thought that if they used heroin, then they could sound like these players, which of course isn't true. But at a certain point, there's a shift in this attitude where we have to recognize as musicians that we don't necessarily, we don't necessarily, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So we celebrate their virtuosity, but it doesn't mean that they're a great person. So we have to keep that in mind, and we have to keep that in mind about ourselves as well. Just because we're great at doing this thing doesn't mean that we have the right to do anything bad like that. So in jazz, we celebrate virtuosity, but it's not just an individualized thing, it's how we communicate with each other on the bandstand and interact. So that brings us to the bebop revolution. So we're gonna play some bebop for you. So the composer of that last tune said, talking about jazz is like dancing about architecture. And that kind of gives you a sense of how he thought about the music. It's much more virtuosic and abstract than the era that came before it of swing music. And a lot of musicians were angry that people who weren't as virtuosic were getting paid and they were getting hired more often than the people that really put in time and thought about improvisation and jazz as being essential. So they decided to bring it back, bring improvisation back. So Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie are considered the founders of bebop, but Thelonious Monk, who composed this last tune, was also a major part in developing bebop, and his idea of dissonance, which you heard a lot, was also another part of it that added to the music. So this is a very angular melody. Somehow it uses all this dissonance, but it's still melodic and fun to listen to, and it's a really fun tune to improvise over. So jazz has developed into a community and has stayed that way for a long time over the years. Jazz has been able... So big bands were communities. They're, like I said before, a group of 20 people traveling across the country together, and they were bandmates. They were brothers. Bebop created its own culture and community outside of what a lot of people really wanted to listen to, and this was really the counterculture of the time. It had its own language. It had its own fashion. They had their own way of playing, and they even took well-known tunes, the changes of well-known tunes, and they wrote their own melodies over them. And you were considered in the know if you could tell what they were playing, even though they weren't playing the same melody. So another big thing in jazz that came out of this were jam sessions. An example of a tune that could be called a jazz session is Well, You Needn't. There are hundreds of tunes in our repertoire that we're required to memorize and be able to play. And after we're confident that we know a tune, we go to a jam session and we try to call it, and we play it in front of people that want to listen to it. So there's this big list. There's 300, 400, 500 jazz standards. Not everyone has the same tunes memorized. So if you're out of town, you can go to a jam session. If you're in town, you can go to a jam session. But you have to find a tune that everyone can play. So you work on a tune for a while, bring it to a jam session, and hopefully everyone else knows it. You pick the tune, count it off, and play it in front of everyone there. And it's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. There's a really big payoff to sounding good in that situation. So on the spot, tunes are, they're different than playing more arranged tunes. So after bebop happened, there was another kind of reaction, and there's two schools of thought that came out of bebop. One was hard bop, and one was cool jazz. So we're gonna play another blues for you, and this is from the hard bop era. All right, so again, that was a reaction to Bebop. Horace Silver wrote that tune, but that tune was played by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And Horace Silver and Art Blakey played together a lot, but the personnel of that band changed around a lot too. So this music attempted to bring back the audience that it had alienated through Bebop. Because it was so dissonant and so abstract, they wanted to come back to the roots of the music. So it was a lot more bluesy. It had, that tune you just heard had some Afro-Cuban influence. And it had, this music also had, the style had a lot of gospel influence as well. So it's another blues, and it's based on the same parameters that I used when I wrote my blues. But notice how different it sounds from that first one. So this is something that could be called at a jam session. It's a little more obscure, so chances are people won't know it that often. And it's also very specifically written. So I had the lower part and Will had the upper part, so you would have to know both parts pretty much. But when Horace wrote this, he wrote it in a minor key, so it's a minor blues. It had that Afro-Cuban beat, and even the title hints at that influence. Jazz is flexible because it can absorb any other music and still sound like jazz, essentially. So Art Blakey said, "Jazz washes away the dust of everyday life." And he was a great educator. He would educate up-and-coming musicians, and this was before there was the institution of jazz education. And he would not only educate them on how to play, but also be part of a band like this one. So he was a little more hardcore than we are at school. Like, he would seek out young Lyons, he would call them, and they were the up-and-coming players, and he would invite them to join the band, and they would play with the band, but he would always have someone waiting in the wing. So they would go to different towns, and he'd ask around and see who was the best player around, and he'd invite them to the concert, and they'd wait in the wing while everyone else was playing, and he told the players that he was with, you know, if you screw up, then I can invite someone else to come out and take your spot in the band. But at the same time, he would have them in the band until he felt that he could push them out into the world on their own. So if they weren't good enough, he would kick them out, but if they were too good, he would also kick them out. So there's that aspect of it, and that was mostly in urban centers like Chicago, Detroit, New York. There was another style that popped up in the same era as this one, and that's cool jazz. It's also called West Coast jazz, because it was really based more around Hollywood. And a lot of musicians moved out to California because they could find more work there because of the booming movie industry. So this style of jazz, the thing that they were trying to do was elevate it into a more sophisticated art form. They did things like experiment with the instrumentation. Sometimes they would have like French horns or tubas playing. All of the tunes were arranged instead of just like playing in a jam session. So I've chosen this tune, Line for Lyons, and the person that wrote this piece was Jerry Mulligan, and he had the Jerry Mulligan Quartet, and the point of this quartet was not to have a piano or guitar player providing the background harmony. So these players really had to provide that harmony with that missing, and you'll see in a second, the composition is very well written. To me, it sounds kind of like Bach, but this was very unusual because it's not something common that happened. They were playing around with what they could do in a band just by subtracting the harmony players. And that brings me to the roles that we have for each member in the band. So the piano or a guitar can play melody lines, but really they're there to provide the harmony. The bass is the timekeeper, and it provides the harmony, as well the drums also provide the rhythm and the tempo. And then the horn players are on top. So really, it's almost like we're building a house. It's not something that you can see, but it is something that you can hear. So the bass and the drums are like building the foundation. The piano and the guitar are the walls of the house. And then the melody on top, provided by the horn players, they're like the windows. They're really what brings the house together. So when we're up here, we're really listening to each other play. And the ultimate goal is to actually have a conversation outside of the parameters of what we're playing. And you heard that with Well, You Needn't. We were reacting to each other. It's really hard to do. And in a setting like the tune that we're about to play, we have to listen to each other to even be able to play it. So we'll go ahead and play that. So during that tune, the chords were going through our heads even though no one was really playing them. Stu played roots on downbeats a lot, but he also played a lot of thirds. So really we had to have the tune in our heads in order to play it effectively. And that's for any tune, really. So everything we've talked about so far leads us to the contemporary tune that I've chosen. This tune was written in the late 90s. It's a Michael Brecker tune, who's considered another innovator of jazz. And it sounds different than anything else that we've played so far. Most of the melody is based off of 5 notes, and the solo section is really only 4 chords. But the way that they've played it makes it sound a lot more complicated than it really is. So it's postmodern again in the way that it draws on music that came before it, but in a new and fresh way. So even the title, it's called African Skies because it's based off an African beat, and it uses a pentatonic scale, which is used in a lot of folk music. All right, so let's go ahead. people's out their opinion that jazz is actually dead. A lot of people aren't listening to it anymore. If you ask the record industry, they would tell you that's true. But it's all about marketing and labeling. Jazz exists today throughout a lot of different kinds of music. I have a lot of friends who have left this program and are playing different music other than jazz, but they've taken what they've learned to play out in the real world. And maybe they would rather play something else. Maybe they find more work playing the music that they're playing right now. But having this knowledge allows them to decide what they want to do. And if you, as a listener, become more informed about jazz, then you can become more informed about all music. And that's just what I want to leave you with.